Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for having me here. It has been a great conference until now, and thank you for being here and online. So what we want to talk about is, well, let me see why. You have to help me.
Yeah, it's not changing.
No, it's not changing.
Let us. Maybe we need to click on this.
Try the enter.
Oh
yeah, now it. So you just arrows will move this.
Thanks. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Okay, so this is the overview. I will start by introducing our project. Then Christian will tell a little bit about probabilistic fallacies. I will introduce the story model and the scenario theory to you. And Dave will talk about causal models and causal Bayesian networks, and we end up with the conclusion and follow-up questions. So this is our project. Our project is in law, in criminal law, where we find that judges make mistakes in evidence evaluation, and that also results sometimes in wrongful convictions and wrongful acquittals. So that's also, societally speaking, a big issue at the moment in our countries and probably in other countries as well. And our project takes the stance that there are two main approaches to fact-finding in law, namely the Bayesian side. It turns out to be very difficult to understand and let alone apply correctly by people who are not trained in it, like judges. Is there an issue?
Yeah.
Yeah, can I go on? Yeah? Okay. Well, the first part, was it not audible or was it okay?
Oh, good. You're now on the screen for the online participants. They can now see you.
Okay, it's just they heard me, but they didn't see me. Okay, so but the most important thing is that they could hear me. Okay, so on the one hand, there's the Bayesian probability theory, and on the other hand, there are causal explanatory theories. And one of them, which I will discuss later, is the scenario theory. And the good thing about them is that they are easy to understand and apply. In the Netherlands, we have some experience with it, and it turns out judges understand it and start to apply it in legal decision making. But the problem is it's less precise, and it doesn't protect against several probabilistic fallacies. And so the question is, are these two incompatible or are they complementary? Now, doesn't work again. That was the loud Sheldon.
Sorry. You just have to, I think, click on it. Yeah. So you need to click on the presentation, and then it's.
Oh, okay. That was perhaps because. Yeah. Okay.
So for some reason it doesn't.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So our project, we applied for funding, and we are in good spirits that we will actually get it, although we are not certain. And what we aim to do in our project is to develop an integrated teaching method in which we combine feasibility with error minimalization. And if our project goes ahead, we will be looking for a PhD to do empirical research and a postdoc to do more practical research and theoretical research. So if you are interested or you know anybody who's interested in the field, let us know. So what is our sort of working hypothesis? Our hypothesis is that if we teach judges first how to create and test causal stories, so do the easy thing, the things they already do, and then teach them how to transform them into causal Bayesian networks, they will improve the structure of their stories, that will improve the way they make inferences, and it can help preventing probabilistic fallacies. So how does this relate to the workshop team? As we understand it, the Bayesian brain hypothesis is mainly about subpersonal levels of cognitions, and that on subpersonal level, human beings, but also other agents, use Bayesian inferences to make predictions about the world. And our project diverges on these 3 points. Firstly, our project, as has become clear by now, I assume, is on the personal level. So the question is, which method or methods do judges use, sometimes explicitly, but possibly also implicitly? And even if they do it implicitly, you can ask them to make explicit what they think they are doing. And this is very important because in the end, their decisions have to be explainable. They have to justify their decisions. And this, of course, is very different from what many of you are doing. It's just about what do people do, whether or not they understand correctly what they're doing. But here we have the issue that judges have to justify the decision, so they have to give good explanations. The second distinction is that we are not that much interested in descriptions. We are not that much interested in the question whether humans do in fact use Bayesian inferences. It's a small part of our project, but not the main part. Also, we are not that much interested in the normative standard, namely the question whether human inference should conform to Bayes' rule. We all three take the stance that yes, they should conform to it, or that they should act in accordance with it, but that doesn't mean that you should prescribe judges to really understand and apply the Bayes' rule sort of consciously. We opt for the position that there might be other methods that are more feasible, like this way of causal reasoning, that might be more feasible for judges and result, nevertheless, in decisions that conform to Bayes' rule. The third point on which we diverge from the Bayesian brain hypothesis is, first, this is a minor point, that most of criminal law is about assessing past crimes. So we deal not with prediction, but with retrodiction. Based on evidence we have now, we try to retrodict whether the evidence is the consequence of the fact that the defendant who is at trial committed a certain crime. I have to say that in criminal law, prediction becomes more and more important because criminal law in many of our Western countries is becoming much more focused on prevention of crimes, and thus in the assessment of the danger of defendants, and therewith prediction is important. But what is more important is that judges do more than simply retrodict, and that's actually the essence of our project, that they use causal explanations, and that they do so not only assess what has happened, but also to assess why things have happened and how they have happened. Because, well, if you convict somebody for a crime, you're not simply going to say, this is what happened. You also have to explain why somebody did it to some extent, and at least how things exactly happened. So, on the personal level, we start from these 3 hypotheses. Our first hypothesis is that judges are not natural Bayesian thinkers, and this shows from a lot of research into with judges and other legal fact finders, that they find it difficult to understand and let alone apply Bayes' rule, but even to understand application of Bayes' rule by others and to see whether others make mistakes in applying Bayes' rule. What has become increasingly clear is that judges and other legal fact finders are storytellers, and the most famous theory in this field is Pennington and Hastie's story model. And when people tell stories, they tell causal stories, and so Pennington and Hastie's story model also show that judges are causal thinkers. They use causal models, they use causal stories to assess evidence and to determine whether a defendant has in fact committed a crime or not. As I said, one of our big issues is, okay, story model, that's good, but is it enough to prevent judges making probabilistic fallacy? And the worry is, of course, that it's not enough. And therefore, I will now give the floor to Christian, and I will move the slide, and he will run through several, through an example which shows what the kind of fallacies that judges make. Christian, the floor is yours, but you're not visible.
I'm not?
David, maybe you can mute yourself, then it will be clear that the one person who speaks keeps in the front.
Okay, can you see and hear me now?
Yeah,
Perfect.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Anne Ruth, and thanks to the organizer for this very nice conference. So I'm just going to say a few things about probabilistic errors that judges are prone to when they assess legal evidence. This is something that I've been studying for many years in the Swedish legal system, which is actually a very good place to do these kinds of studies because we don't have juries in Sweden. Evidence is assessed by judges, and they write very detailed, reasoned opinions on how they assess the evidence. So reading these opinions, you can have a field day finding all kinds of probabilistic errors in reasoning. I have some examples here on the slide. When people mention the probabilistic errors in legal reasoning, you almost always hear these examples: prosecutor's fallacy, base rate neglect. These are the classical examples. But that's just the beginning of the list. I have some more examples here: false positive neglect, underestimating converging evidence. And I have in my studies of Swedish courts identified 10 different probabilistic reasoning errors, also stuff like double counting and using the wrong reference class and stuff like that. And I'm going to just briefly here give you one example of a very famous Swedish case where you see the example of underestimating converging evidence. This is the so-called Malin Lindström murder case, which is a very, very famous case in Sweden. I think it's one of the most written about cases. There are hundreds and hundreds of newspaper articles and stuff about this case. It happened in the 1990s. This girl on the left, Malin Lindström, 16-year-old, living in the north of Sweden, was taking a bus to visit a friend. She got off the bus at the wrong bus stop and disappeared. And there was a big search for her, and she wasn't found until several months later, because this was in the winter in the very north of Sweden. So there was a lot of snow, and her body was covered by the snow. But when the snow melted, she was found, and it was obvious that a very serious crime had been committed. She had been murdered and raped. Her hands and feet had been tied with tape, and there was clear signs of sexual violence, and she was stabbed multiple times in the back with a knife. And the main suspect in this murder investigation is this young man on the right. Olaf is his name. He was 18 at the time of the crime, and he was prosecuted for this crime 2 years later. And this is a typical crime of circumstantial evidence. There were a long list of circumstantial evidence. Maybe we could go to the next slide. I'm not going to mention all of them, but here are the most important ones. First of all, Olaf was the last person seen with Malin before she disappeared. He lived in a house which was exactly just very close to the bus stop where she got off. And several witnesses who passed the bus stop in cars saw Malin and also identified him because they knew him. This was a small village in the north of Sweden, walking side by side on the road where the bus stop, where she got off the bus. So he's the last person seen with Malin. When the police searched his house, they found several things that were very compromising for him. Most importantly, a blue textile fiber in his garage, found on scissors, but also in other places in his garage. The thing was that Malin wore a blue sweater, which when the body was found was cut to pieces with a scissor. And the fiber in the sweater was very unusual because the combination of the fiber and the color, it was one store in Sweden that sold this, and they had it specially made in Hong Kong, this particular color. So in all this big province in north of Sweden, there were only 4 other sweaters sold with the same fiber color. And also in his house, the police found under an outhouse a plastic bag hidden, and in this plastic bag there were some more scissors and knives, and there were 2 rolls of tape, which happened to be the exact same kind of tape as the tapes that Malin's body was taped with. Her hands and feet were taped with two rolls of tapes, 2 different kinds, and the same kinds as were found on the body. Also, when they searched his house, they found drawings made by him of naked women and corpses. And the naked women in the drawings were tied up in the same way as she was tied up. And the corpses had wounds in the same places that she had in the back, but also in the leg. The police suspected that she at a certain point might have tried to escape, and he stabbed her in the leg to stop her. So, and these drawings then were not only character evidence in the sense of showing an interest in these kind of crimes, but actually seemed to be documentations of the crimes as such, as they had so many resemblances with her body at the crime scene. So moving to the next slide, and Ruth, please. So what happened is that he was prosecuted in 1998. He was convicted in the municipal court on this evidence, but acquitted in the appeals court. And what the appeals court did in this case is that they didn't estimate the converging, combined, concurring force of the evidence. They just looked at every piece of circumstantial evidence separately. So they looked at, for example, the textile fiber, and they said, well, this isn't enough on its own to prove beyond reasonable doubt that he's the guy. So, okay, let's move to the next piece of evidence. And well, this isn't enough on its own either, so then let's move to the next piece, and so forth. And he was acquitted. And this then became a cold case for many years. I wrote a book in 2018 where I analyzed this case in depth and did a Bayesian analysis of the case, and assessing with the probability calculus the probability that you would see all these converging pieces of evidence against him if he actually had been innocent. And I showed that that probability was in the magnitude of 1 in 100 million or something like that. So I argued in that book that he should have been convicted on the original evidence. Then the police reopened the case. And the thing is that on Malin's jeans, there was a stain from semen, which the police had noticed in the original investigation. But with the DNA methods that were available in the 1990s, it wasn't possible to establish a DNA profile from the stain because the quantity was so little. But with the technical developments in securing DNA evidence that had happened over these 20 years, a new analysis in 2020 actually produced a DNA profile which matched Olaf. So the case was then reopened, and the Supreme Court just now in May 2022 granted a new trial, which I just followed last week in Sundsvall, and we're all expecting him to be convicted. And I think this is a very nice illustration of how things can go very wrong because of the fact that judges are not Bayesian thinkers naturally, and they have no training in probability calculus. And this is also what, in my opinion, you need to have to, because the problem is the judges didn't know, the appeals court judges, how to combine this evidence. They didn't have a method for assessing the combined strength of the converging evidence. So that's why they just looked at it piece by piece. And in my view, what needs to be done here is that judges need to get some basic education in probability calculus. You don't solve this with inference to the best explanations or scenarios or relative plausibility or coherence or anything else. You actually need some basic competence in probability calculus. And what I've been doing in Sweden for several years is that I have a course at Lund University at the law school, where we do have a 10-week course in evidence, where we actually teach, where I teach my students to build Bayesian networks and assess legal evidence in a correct Bayesian way. But now let's move on to Dave.
The microphone is off, the mic is on now.
Okay, so we first move back to me and not to Dave. Yeah. This was the order you wanted, Christian. So much for your Bayesian calculus. So because we move back to where Christian ended, like, okay, is scenario theory, the story model, is it this helpful, and is it sufficient to analyze these cases such as the one that Christian just presented? And I will argue for the claim that it does help judges to think in a scenario manner, but I agree with Christian, it's not sufficient if you have such a complex case with a lot of circumstantial evidence, because the scenario theory doesn't give you the tools to really analyze it. But then again, the scenario theory is a good starting point for judges who have this trouble with Bayes to get used to think in a Bayesian manner in a way that we hope, at least that's our project, will eventually really teach them how to think in a Bayesian manner without panicking about formulas. But first, let us start with Pennington and Hastie's descriptive story model. Perhaps most of you know it already, but it's psychological research from the 1980s and the 1990s, where Pennington and Hastie did a lot of research, especially with jury members. And what they found in their experiment is that if a fact finder is confronted with a lot of evidence with a complex criminal case, what they will do is impose a narrative structure on trial information. So they will try to make a story out of the pieces of evidence they have. And so what is a story? A story, well, like in literature, but a story consists of episodes, and each episode consists of specific elements, namely initiating event, a psychological response or a goal, an action and a consequence. And you could apply this to Christian's case, like the initiating event was that they met at this bus stop, and then probably Olof had some response or a goal, even that, well, he had his victim and he tried to lead her away into the forest. Then there was this action, first the rape, etc., and eventually the killing, and the consequence was that she died. Now, if you tell this story, you get a story that is linked both temporally and causally. So that's the connection. Moreover, the elements are hypotheses. Like in science, you could see the story as a sort of the scientific theory, the analog, and the elements are all hypotheses within the story. And they have two roles. First, the hypotheses causally explain the subsequent elements, so the hypotheses are connected to each other in the story. But of course, more importantly, they also have to be able to causally explain the evidence. So that's sort of the superstructure of the stories we tell. And Pennington and Hastie say what we see is what people do when they sort of finally assess whether this is a good story they made up. They ask themselves, does the story explain all of the evidence? They ask themselves, okay, is this the unique story? Is this the one and only story? Or are there more stories that more or less plausible? If so, then the plausibility of the story chosen will be less than if it's the one and only story. And instead of talking in terms of probability, people think in terms of consistency and coherence. First, they will say, okay, is this story plausible in light of general background knowledge? I mean, as soon as you start thinking in terms of man of Mars who did things, it's no longer plausible. But this story that Christian just told is also plausible in the light of background knowledge. The other thing they assess is whether the story is consistent with evidence and whether it's internally consistent and whether the story structure is complete. So if the story has all these episodes that connect and the episode has all the elements that connect the episodes. And that is what people do. Now in the Netherlands, Peter van Koppen has turned his story model into a prescriptive model. It's called the scenario theory. And actually he has had quite some success. At some point, like Christian, the example that Christian just gave, we had the opposite case of a person who was convicted for murdering a small child. And Peter van Koppen analyzed the case and said, if I take this story model, it's simply impossible. This guy cannot have done it. The time frame doesn't fit, but also the description of the perpetrator doesn't fit. And a few years later, it turned out, indeed, this man was innocent. So you see the scenario theory does do some job. So what Van Koppen says is actually do what Pennington and Hastie say that people do, but do it consciously, be aware of what you're doing and actively use these principles. Really try to make up different reasonable alternative scenarios. And that is inference to the best explanation, of course. And this will prevent tunnel vision, like we have the guy and we will nail them. And the other thing he emphasizes is try to also falsify the scenario you have. So not just comparing, but actively looking for evidence that goes against your scenario. So really the Popperian approach of making predictions and finding out whether they come out or not. And assess discriminating facts. So see whether facts do or do not discriminate between different scenarios. And Dave will tell a little bit more about that later on. And this certainly helps to prevent confirmation bias. And finally, you have to assess how thorough the research for evidence and alternative scenarios was, because even if you end up believing this is the best scenario, but you see that the research has been sloppy, the investigations have been sloppy, well, better not stick to it and send the police and prosecution back to the drawing board. And you could already see that there is some connection between scenario theory and the Bayesian approach, because you could say, okay, talking in terms or thinking in terms of the plausibility of the scenario is asking people to give a prior to your scenario, and looking for discriminating facts and actively thinking about it is an analog of the likelihood ratio. So in this sense, it's really a natural way to introduce Bayes to judges. But the question is this enough? Does it offer a feasible approximation of Bayesian approach? So is the best or the most plausible scenario always the most probable scenario? And well, we all three believe not always so. So we have to do more to get there. And now I'll give the floor to Dave that will take us to this next step. But something has to be done.
Yes, I think that for Dave to be able to share his screen, I need to stop sharing this screen. Oh, sorry. Freigebe stoppen, yeah? That's the, Okay, and Dave, you should be able to, yeah, perfect.
And now Dave is still Christian instead of Dave?
But Dave needs to start talking.
Oh, okay.
And
I can
then
start talking. Hi, guys. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, perfect.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much for inviting us. I just did a bit of a last minute thing. So just, I thought Christian was going to present a Bayesian of his story, and he didn't. And so I was just quickly doing one. So I've tried to get one up and running. We'll see how it goes if I can actually present it. But anyway, let me get back to my original talk. So you can see my slides, okay? Okay, oops, okay. So as Anne-Ruth has actually laid things out really nicely. So I'm just going to kind of like maybe delve a little bit more into the psychology and also the approach of using normative causal models. So just to summarize, years and years of psych research, people are good at generating explanations. And when I say good, we have a great kind of capacity to just generate an explanation based on minimal data, minimal evidence. We come up with a story that explains things. So this is what we're good at. But also research shows that we're less competent at evaluating these stories against evidence. And also we're less competent at doing proper kind of full Bayesian computation. Okay, so I would say that's kind of a fair summary of a lot of research now. But I think that there's been a bit of a false dichotomy in the literature, in the psychological literature, and maybe more broadly in the normative literature, between explanation-based norms versus Bayesian norms. And I think that this has been a problem because people think that if you are like a storyteller or a causal modeler, there are different norms might apply, or even, and how do you kind of like apply Bayesian norms? And I think that's a kind of false dichotomy. There's no reason why you can't apply Bayesian norms to storytelling and explanation. And so as you, Anne-Ruth has anticipated, so one, I mean, this isn't the only solution, but I think one, really kind of like encouraging solution is to think about causal models as they're formalized in terms of either causal Bayesian nets or some other kind of formalization, but that's the one I'm going to run with today, which both gives you a kind of normative framework for causal inference and probabilistic inference in the same framework, which I think is a really great achievement of people like Judea Pearl have really achieved something magnificent by doing this. But it also presents us a language, if you like, to represent causal stories and scenarios. So things that were normally thought to be outside the Bayesian domain, we can now represent them more formally, and we can see what kind of probabilistic inferences they license. And also, following up on that, it could be seen as a method to improve evidential reasoning by having a formalism that actually captures causal inference, which is what we kind of naturally do, but also helps systematize and make it much more consistent, the kinds of inferences we draw to avoid biases and probabilistic fallacies. So that's the plan. And let's see if this works. Oh, great. Okay. So I'm going to give you an example, a different case, and show you just how Bayesian inference works. But just so that you can see that we're a little bit more joined up than it appears. You can see this model. I just did a really quick model, a Bayesian model of Christian's case, where we've got Olaf as the kind of central, whether or not Olaf did it as the central node. And then we have evidence like the blue fibers, the tape, the drawings. And also I would model something like opportunity as a precursor or a precondition of him being guilty. And also the character, which also is kind of like you've got the drawings are evidence both of character, but also evidence of, if you like, the carrying out of a crime. Okay, so I just did that really quickly. I haven't had a chance to put numbers to it or anything, but just to show you that how naturally we can, like draw up, not just think through a causal model, but potentially formalize it a bit. So this is like a causal graph. Okay, but I'm going to switch now to a case that a pre-prepared case, which I've done quite a lot of psychological work on. So I think it's a useful case to just, I kind of know what people can do well, and I also know what aspects people might struggle with. So this is the case I'm going to kind of like go with for the rest of the presentation. So this was a case in that reported child abuse, where these parents they found that their child was bruised and was bleeding from the mouth, and they didn't really know why, according to them. So they took it into the hospital, and the hospital actually they ended up being accused of abusing their child. So they took the baby to the they took the baby to the hospital when they discovered bleeding in its mouth, and then the doctors examined the child. They found bruises on the baby's body, which led them to then take some x-rays, and the x-rays revealed fractures. And at this point, they suspected child abuse, so they took the child out of the parents' care and placed it in adoption while they launched a criminal case. Now, during the process of the criminal investigation, they discovered that the child was actually suffering from a rare blood disorder, which could lead to spontaneous bleeding and bruising. And also, in another kind of twist, if you like, the prosecution hired a radiologist, an expert radiologist, to go over the evidence of fractures. And he actually argued that there weren't fractures, that the x-rays actually didn't show fractures. So conflicting with the previous radiologists. Okay, so at this point, the court exonerated the couple. There was no case to answer. I mean, it got a bit more complicated because then they needed to get their child back from adoption. Okay, so this is a case, it was in the papers a few years ago, and I just thought it'd be a good thing to model and then maybe present to people as a case study. So here's a really simplified causal model of the case. We've got the two possible causes of the bruises, and we can talk about those other evidence as well, but I'm just going to keep it simple here. And then we've also got abuse would be a cause of fractures, and then we have, let's say, two different x-ray reports about whether or not there are fractures, and we've also got a test for the disorder. Okay, and then so it's a simple model, and you can use this to do inference. And just to step through it, a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with how Bayes nets work. So we've got the bruises, which are diagnostic both of abuse and disorder. So the probability of abuse and disorder both go up. And as the probability of abuse goes up, you then predict that fractures become more likely. And in the next they did the kind of looked at the x-rays, and they thought they reported fractures, which makes abuse more likely, which then reduces the probability of disorder by explaining away. And then in the so this is a kind of like important feature of causal reasoning, that you get this explaining away inference. And then this was the main evidence in the family court. And then in the subsequent investigation, we had the positive test for the disorder, which obviously raises the probability that the child had the disorder, which explains away to a certain extent the abuse, which itself then, reduces the probability of fractures. And then the final bit of evidence we'll add is the x-ray report saying that there weren't fractures. And again, this reduces the probability of fractures, reduces the probability of abuse, by explaining away actually increases the probability of disorder. Okay, so this is just like a microcosm of how you can use a model to do causal and probabilistic reasoning. And the idea here is, and so one thing I did, and this is one example, but I use this a lot to study people's inferences, giving them this case, seeing how they update their beliefs, also looking at how they model the case, a whole range of things I looked at. And these are just like the kind of like broad conclusions that people readily construct causal models pretty much like this. And most people constructed a model like this or something very similar. And they also made pretty good qualitative inferences. They kind of like evidence, raise something or it lowers something appropriately. So that was pretty good. But what maybe wasn't so good was they were less accurate at exact kind of quantitative Bayesian updating. And you might think that doesn't matter too much, but actually in this kind of case and other cases, it can matter a lot more than you think. Okay, and I'm just gonna, so what, in the course of doing this, looking at this case, we identified what we thought was a bit of another probabilistic reasoning fallacy, if you like, which I think is quite pervasive. And I'm just gonna flag this particular example, but obviously, you can look at all, many different probabilistic fallacies through the same lens. Okay, and we've titled this zero-sum fallacy or zero-sum reasoning, and I'll see if I can explain it just quickly in this slide. And as I said, we've got loads of research on this now, that people do seem to do this. So people seem to assume that if you have an effect, let's say bruises, which is equally predicted by two causes here. So bruises is equally predicted by abuse and disorder. Then you actually don't take it as being diagnostic of abuse, okay? But that is actually a fallacy unless abuse and disorder are exclusive and exhaustive. And clearly in this case, and in many other cases they're not, here the parents could have abused the child and the child could have had the disorder. That's perfectly feasible, or it could have been neither of those explanations for the bruises. So in this case, they're clearly not exhaustive or exclusive, and yet people tended to not treat the bruises as probative of abuse. Okay, and I think this is, well, I know this is quite a common mistake that people make. Okay, and so another thing that they seem to do, which I think is part the opposite side of a coin, is they tend to over-explain away. So when you get some evidence, for example, getting test results saying disorder, then people massively decrease the probability of abuse, much more than they should do. Really, they should just bring it back down to baseline where it was before, but they massively decrease it. And again, this is a kind of, I think this is the opposite side of zero-sum reasoning, whereby you think that the evidence supports one of the competing causes or the other. It can't support both. And if it goes for one, the other one has to go down significantly. So it's a kind of if you like, a heuristic way of dealing with this inference pattern. Okay, and just effectively, I think in these cases, people often treat alternative explanations as exclusive and exhaustive, and they shouldn't. And this, I think, is symptomatic of maybe a mistake we might make when we construct stories. So the idea is that we might think, oh, we've got story one, the abuse story, and we've got the disorder story, the innocent story, and we see them as exclusive and exhaustive, and we take evidence that potentially supports both as irrelevant evidence. Okay, and that's a mistake. And I've got many cases now, we've looked at this in many contexts. So and even actually when people are explicitly told that the causes are exclusive, are not exclusive, people still subscribe to this error. Okay, so this is just one of many things, and I just want to highlight this because this seems like a nice example of a fallacy which you can't just correct through better story thinking. You need some way of evaluating alternative causes against the evidence, and I think that using a Bayes net really clarifies things here. Okay, so yeah, I mean so the proposal is to try and correct these kinds of errors. If we can teach people better to use Bayes nets, or to actually thinking in a way that fits with Bayesian prescripts, then we can do a better job and avoid some of these fallacies and erroneous reasoning errors. Okay, so in a way, the idea is to build upon people's propensity for causal thinking. So their ability to construct causal graphs, their ability often to give sensible parameters, we want to build on that, but obviously give them support via Bayes nets so that they can reason consistently and probabilistically correctly. And it will also help them integrate large bodies of evidence. Very similar to the case, I mean, Christian's case, it wasn't a large body of evidence, but you had to combine different pieces of evidence, and many legal cases, there's a large body of evidence. So I think you need a tool to help people systematically evaluate evidence. And also you can use the tool to explore inferences, and you can do lots of extra things with the tool. I don't have a chance to talk about that right now, but the key thing here for these purposes of the talk is you can correct what might be faulty intuitions you have by using the tool to check through the consistency of your conclusions. Okay, and just a quick, I'm not sure how we're doing for time, but really quick. So we've done some prior work on this, not in the legal domain so much, but a project, I think Ulrika mentioned it yesterday, that Ulrika and I were on this large project, IARPA project, where we were trying to improve probabilistic reasoning, and we used an interactive Bayes net tool, and it massively improved people's reasoning on the problems we gave them. Obviously, we don't know how long that improvement sustained beyond the training, the couple of days that we tested them. Okay, and what was interesting about this is that we incorporated many of the problems that would typically be raised in legal cases. So I feel that that's a very good start to how to improve inference. Am I going on too long? Or I've got one more slide actually.
I don't know whether it's your fault, but we only have 10 minutes left. So.
Oh no. Okay. Look, I'm going to say. Okay. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip this. If anyone's interested, we also show how you, even by drawing a Bayes net, you can improve your inference. Okay, blah, 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 skip all that. Nice pictures. Okay, we're just on the conclusion now. And the conclusion is obvious in a way that we have a natural propensity for causal thinking, for developing stories and scenarios, but that can lead to error, and it can also mean that we can't evaluate the evidence as well. By incorporating Bayesian approaches in a systematic way, by using causal Bayes nets or some other framework, we feel that that could be a really nice way of teaching judges and other people to reason better about evidence. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much.